Welcome to my channel. This is JC Rock and Metal Reviews. My name is John. So I was watching a few videos on some of my favorite YouTube channels, and two of them recently mentioned the band Grand Funk Railroad. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a video on this band. But before I do that, let me mention those two channels that recently spoke of the band. I don't want them to think I'm like stealing their ideas or anything like that. So the channels are Lair of the Alchemist and Roberts on My Turntable, and I will link those channels in the description. So this video is going to be a little different. I'm not going to be focused on one particular album. I'm just going to give a brief history of the band, and we're going to talk about their rise to fame and how at one time they were actually like as big as the Beatles.
So the first time I heard of this band, it was back in like the late 80s. I was a teenager and I was reading this metal magazine. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember that there was an article in it and it talked about how Grand Funk Railroad was like the Guns N' Roses of like the early 70s, and how they packed stadiums and they were like a hard rock band. They were super popular and like everybody went to their concerts. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I wanted to hear the band, and back then we didn't have any YouTube, so I couldn't really just like go to Spotify or anything, so I had to actually go out and buy an album. So I went to a local record store. It was actually like a used bookstore, and they sold a lot of like records and vinyl and all that. So I flipped through all the records and I found a live album. It was their second live album. I will put a little image up here right now of it, and it had like songs like The Locomotion and We're an American Band. I thought it was a pretty cool. So that was my first introduction to the band.
So Grand Funk Railroad is an American hard rock band from Flint, Michigan. They got the name from a railway in their hometown called the Grand Trunk Western Railroad. They're a trio. They formed in 1969, and they are Mark Farner on guitars and vocals, Don Brewer on drums and vocals, and Mel Schatcher on bass. So they played at the 1969 at the Atlanta International Pop Festival, and from that show they were signed by Capitol Records. So they released their first album in 1969 that was titled On Time. That album went gold, and their second album was Grand Funk. It was self-titled, or sometimes called the Red Album. So that one went gold in 1970. And their first big hit was I'm Your Captain, Closer to Home. So that was released in 1970, and from the album of the same name, Closer to Home. So that was a song that catapulted them into stardom. Now, by 1971, they're like selling out stadiums, and one particular stadium is called Shea Stadium. That's home to the New York Mets, and it's located in Queens, New York. And they sold out this show in 72 hours. Now that's something that even the Beatles couldn't do themselves. The Beatles, it would take like them maybe a few weeks to sell out. But this band, they were like so big, they sold out like right away. Now in 1971, they released two more studio albums. They released Survival and E Pluribus Funk. The latter had an embossed description of the Shea Stadium on the album's back cover. And also, as a side note, Shea Stadium no longer exists. It was bought out by Citibank. It was like demolished and rebuilt. It's now Citi Field. The venue is still home to the New York Mets. I know I have some Mets fans, so if they want to comment on that, down below they can. At that time, they were being managed by Terry Knight. This guy, he's kind of like a shady dude, and they weren't happy with it, with how he was like working with them, so they fired him in 1972. Now that's when things got really ugly, and Terry Knight, sued them for breach of contract. The legal battle went on for like about 2 years, and eventually they settled out of court, but The band really got screwed over. Terry Knight, he kept most of the royalties and copyrights to all of their material from like 1969 to 1972. That was like their heydays. The only thing the band did keep was the rights to the name Grand Funk Railroad. So they just had to like continue on.
So it's really sad, kind of. The band, they were young, they didn't know what they were getting into. They really got the short end of the stick. I mean, like so many years later, they could be collecting royalties from all of their music and all the records they recorded in the early 70s, but they lost it all. And like I said, it's very sad. Like that's all residual income that can be going to them and their families and their kids, like once they're gone and all that. But they lost it all just because of a shady contract deal. So I thought that was really sad.
Later in 1972, so the band added Craig Frost on keyboards. They originally wanted Peter Frampton, but he was not available. They eventually released 2 more albums in this period. One was called Phoenix in 1972, and another one was called We're an American Band in 1973. You probably know the hit song from that album. So at that time, they had Todd Rundgren as producer, and they kind of changed the musical style a little bit, more of like an R&B, R&B blues, that kind of thing. That song I just mentioned, the title track, We're an American Band, that was number 1, and they had another number 1 hit later called The Locomotion. The Locomotion was a cover song. We know it was written by Carole King and originally recorded by Little Eva. So that song came off of their album Shining On. And then in 1974, they released another album. It's called All the Girls in the World Beware. This is kind of like a cheesy looking album. It looks like the early version of Photoshop. Even that software wasn't available at the time, but it shows all the members, like the heads of the members superimposed on these muscle-bound bodies. One of them was Arnold Schwarzenegger. But, it was a decent album. It had another top 10 hits. Actually, it had 2 more top 10 hits, Some Kind of Wonderful and Bad Time. So at this point, the band started to really suffer burnout. I mean, they forged ahead because they needed 2 more albums to fulfill their contract with Capitol. So they went on tour again, and they recorded a double live album. That was the one I mentioned previously, called Caught in the Act. So Capitol didn't consider the double live album like enough to fulfill the contract, and they wanted 1 more album. So the band just went ahead, and they released an album called Born to Die. So if you take a look at the cover on that one, it shows the band in coffins. It's kind of dark. But that was released in 1976. That album didn't really do too well, and the band, started to drift apart. And I'm going to end the story here. I don't want this video to be like super long. I'm going to do a part 2. And as a spoiler, they did went on to work with someone who was a member of KISS for a long time, but you'll have to find that out later. Comment below. What do you think of Grand Funk Railroad? Let me know what do you think of the band and things like that. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I do videos like this. I want to kind of do more of these types of videos, where I tell the band's history. So again, let me know what you think and check out these other 2 videos up top. We got some more classic rock videos here if you're interested in that. And let me just close this out. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.